Well, we've been saying all week on the live streams on Twitch, usually in response to the question, can Mercedes win a Grand Prix before the end of the year, that because the weather is so changeable in Brazil, the variables may well come into play again, as they did in Singapore, as they did at Suzuka. Well, indeed, they did come into play at Interlagos, but it didn't have the result that Mercedes were hoping for. On this occasion, it was none other than Kevin Magnussen taking the pole for the sprint race for Haas-Ferrari. Let me repeat that. Kevin Magnussen on the pole for Haas-Ferrari. It's a little bit like Nico Hülkenberg getting the pole at Interlagos at Williams all those years ago. So great. Yeah, it throws up these variables. It throws up these surprise results at Interlagos. The crowd loved it. Why not? End of year, championships are over, and here's K-Mag on the pole. Congratulations to him. Congratulations to the team. Obviously, they work very closely with Ferrari, but it's been a long haul for Gene Haas to get this far, and he deserves it. He deserves that pole, no question about that. As does Kevin Magnussen. Think back to the beginning of his career, second in his first Grand Prix for McLaren, kind of went downhill from there. But Haas had faith in him, and they brought him back into the team this year, and he's driven really well. I feel a bit sorry, I've got to say, for Mick Schumacher, because in the beginning of the day at Interlagos, he was within a couple of tenths of Kevin, but didn't get it together in Q1. Same old story for Mick. But nonetheless, that shouldn't detract in any way from Kevin Magnussen's achievement. Lots of other guys who went well in this weird Q3 with all the variables coming into play. We'll get onto that in a minute, how the variables did come into play. Lots of other guys would have been thinking, yeah, this is a real opportunity. And Kevin was the guy that did it, partly because he was first out on track. Haas in a great position as ever in the pit lane, as a result of where they finished in the championship last year, of course, able to get their car right out front of anybody else. And that a little bit told the story, because the rain started to fall. Everybody knew there was only going to be one lap. Well, again, let's get onto that in a little bit when we come to Charles Leclerc and Ferrari. But everybody else knew there was only going to be one lap on the soft, slick tyre. And it was Kevin who put it together absolutely without fault, as far as I can see. Let's have a look at his sector times and what he did. 18.4 in sector 1. That compares with Max Verstappen. He did 18.3 in sector 1, so there or thereabouts, you got to say. Don't see anybody else who was quicker. And that's possibly because already the rain was starting to fall, and breaking into turn 1 is one place you don't want to have a lock-up. Sebastian Vettel, take note. What happened to him in Q2. 36.2 in sector 2, and that's really what got in the pole, because if anyone was going to beat him, it was going to be Max Verstappen. Max not brilliantly happy with the Red Bull all day in terms of its slow corner turn-in. 36.6 had a lock-up in sector 2, really good in sector 3, 16.9, but then again, Kevin Magnussen did 16.9. So now they're on the straight. They've both got good acceleration out of that last corner up the hill. What does Max cross the line at? 3.27. It's been the story all day, the story all year. Red Bull, Honda, incredibly quick in a straight line, just through the air. Amazing aero efficiency. You could say, indeed, that probably they should have given him a bit more wing, a bit more downforce for that sector 2, because his advantage in a straight line was just ridiculous. 3.27. Kevin Magnussen with the Ferrari engine, 3.17. 3.17 compared with Max, 3.27, but still got the pole. Brilliant. 11.6 compared with 11.8. 11.6 compared with 11.8 of Max Verstappen. So that's how the pole happened. It was a fraught qualifying from beginning to end, because the weather looked as if it was going to close in, but then it didn't, and there was a little bit of slow running, of slick running at the end of Q1. The worst call, this is even worse, I think, than Charles Leclerc being put onto intermediates at the Monaco Grand Prix, when quite clearly he should have been on slicks, or indeed that call to put him on hard tyres in Hungary. This, just when you thought Ferrari had finally sort of turned the corner when it came to strategy and planning and what they're going to do, Charles Leclerc leaves the pit lane at the beginning of Q3, when it's still more or less dry, as we saw from all the other times, the only driver on intermediate tyres. Now, given his fury afterwards, and he kept his helmet on wisely, because if he didn't, I'm sure there would have been a lot worse going on. Given how upset he was, and of course it blew it completely, P10 he's going to be starting. Given that, you've got to assume that a lot of this decision making was again made by the Ferrari strategy team. I mean, you would imagine now that Charles would have been completely involved in all decisions like this, on the ground decisions of slicks or wets, intermediates or slicks, semi-wet, semi-dry. And if you throw in the added factor of a driver like Charles Leclerc being able to get more out of slicks in a semi-wet condition than, say, a driver like Carlos Sainz, let alone a lot of his opposition, why wouldn't they have put him on slicks for that first run? There was absolutely no downside. Get in the lap, even if it started to rain, they could bring him in, put him on intermediates. At least they've had to go on the slick tyre. It was just incomprehensible. And he was livid afterwards, as you can imagine. So he's starting P10. Carlos Sainz has a 5-place grid penalty because of an engine change. So nice job by Ferrari. I mean, this was a day when Ferrari could have been on the pole. They could have been on the pole with Charles Leclerc. I firmly believe that. But unbelievable. Just what they did. And it's easy. I suppose it's easy to say, oh, well, you know, Windsor, you're sitting there, Monday morning quarterback, well, in this case, a Friday night quarterback. But it's not. You know, everybody else was out on slicks. He was the only driver on intermediates. And it's not even a gamble. It would be a gamble if everybody else on intermediates and he was the only driver on slicks. That would be a bit of a gamble, but not the other way. Not when you're going conservative with a driver like Charles Leclerc. That is what is so stupefying, I think. So let's have a look at the grid for the sprint race tomorrow. This is for the sprint, don't forget. But that doesn't matter, does it? If you're Kevin Magnussen in your Haas, it doesn't matter. He's on the pole for the Brazilian Grand Prix. Max Verstappen will be starting second. He's pretty happy with that P2, I would imagine, particularly if the weather's going to be a bit dodgy, because as we've seen at Singapore and in Japan, with these tyres, with these cars, whatever it is, sometimes it's better not to be on the clean side of the grid where there's quite a lot of rubber. And Max will be lining up, looking for, obviously, a good sprint race from the front row of the grid. Nothing to lose because he's got his championships going. Everything to gain, of course. And George Russell, P3. Now, it was George, in a way, that put paid to Charles Leclerc's attempt even to come back onto six. Oh, and there's one thing I should add, I forgot to say about, it makes it even worse for the Charles Leclerc Ferrari thing, is that Ferrari obviously realised halfway, 2/3 of the way around his lap on intermediates, and he did a time lapse on intermediates. They realised 2/3 of the way around that it was a mistake. So they called him in to put him on slicks just as he went past the entrance to the pit lane. And that was too late. He had to do yet another lap, and by the time, of course, he went out, it was raining. So absolutely horrendous. Wrong call, and then very, very poor radio as well. And let's just, before we get onto it, so I don't want to confuse it too much, Charles Leclerc's lap, 18.9 on intermediates in Sector 1. Okay, that's what Carlos Sainz did on slicks in Sector 1. He did 18.8. Sergio Perez did 18.8. Mind you, he was stuck behind Charles Leclerc at the time, so no surprise there. Okay, Fernando Alonso did 18.9 in Sector 1. Fernando Alonso, let's take that as a yardstick. He's on his slicks, 36.4 in Sector 2. Charles Leclerc, 38.9 on intermediates in the dry. And 17.1 Fernando Alonso, Sector 3. Charles Leclerc, 22.4 on intermediates in Sector 3. So that's how slow, that's how pathetic it was for that Ferrari to be on intermediates. Anyway, getting back to the point, George Russell had been his usual self, you know, always slightly quicker than Lewis, particularly when it was semi-wet and the conditions were a bit dodgy and he was just pushing a little bit here, pushing a little bit there. Nothing wrong with that. That is how George Russell drives. But as I've been saying all year, when we've had this clear back-to-back between George and Lewis, in terms of comparing the way they drive, Lewis has got that slightly earlier shorter corner, slightly earlier turn in, shall we call it, than George, but not by a lot. George is pretty good in that area. But the big difference, of course, is in the inputs. Lewis has got this beautiful syrupy feel to the steering and the brakes, the footwork and the handwork, whereas George has just a slight jink on every initial input. You can see it when you're looking at head-ons of the car, and you can actually see it at the corner where George made his mistake. That head-on shot as they're coming down the first long straight, you can see Lewis just has that beautiful Max Charles-like peeling off into the early approach to the corner, whereas George, there's always that slight jink. And it was a slight jink that did it. It was that slight lump that he has in his driving compared with Lewis Hamilton, added to the fact that he was on the white line when he made the jink. If Lewis does that on the white line, he's probably going to have slightly less reaction from the car. But because it was George, because it was one of those, and because he was on the white line and the white line was wet, the car did that and the corner had gone. He went straight on. And then mirroring, got to say a little bit, the rather awkward, inelegant, probably is the right word, donuts and other stuff he was doing in Las Vegas earlier this week at the opening of the Vegas Grand Prix party, compared with Lewis, who was beautiful to watch, Nigel Mansell-esque with his concentric circle donuts. George was always a little bit ungainly. At one moment, Lewis stitched him up in the pace car, the safety car, when he took away the whatever it is they do. Presumably they lock the diff so that he can just go round and round and round, and Lewis flicked the switch. That's fine. But in the F1 car, George also looked a little bit weird. And so it was today. He went down towards the perimeter road, which was fine, through the gravel trap at high speed, probably damaging the car quite badly, but the underfloor. But onto the gravel trap, through the gravel trap, onto the perimeter road, and then gunned it and spun it back into the gravel trap. It was, that was inelegant. Sorry, that was inelegant. Because one of the things that's always nice about Grand Prix drivers is to see what they do in these very weird situations which we don't normally find them, whether it's reverse parking, three-point turns, going through a narrow gap, whatever it is. It's always nice to see their finesse. And this was not very pleasant to watch. Anyway, George seemed to be thinking it was quite funny at the end of it when he was being interviewed, and nobody actually asked him why he went off in the first place. I suppose they felt, well, it's probably not a good thing to do, but to ask him, that is. But it was pretty clear to my eye what happened, and it was just one of those lumps that he has on his steering, and it could well have been brakes as well, because he's always going to hit the brake pedal slightly harder than Lewis does initially. Nothing to do with measuring how much G they put through the brake pedal, but just to do with the initial movement. That is the difference between George and Lewis, and it's been clear all year when we've had this back-to-back comparison in the Mercedes. But anyway, he does start third. I'm sure Mercedes will do a brilliant job and repair the car perfectly for him, and he'll start third. He's in good shape, obviously, to get a good result from the sprint race now. Lando Norris, who was quick, he's quick all qualifying, Q1, Q2, Q3, didn't do a lot of fast running in FP1 this morning, but put in some good long runs for McLaren, way below the radar, as ever with McLaren. And there were rumours about him not feeling very well, but I mean, I'm sure they were completely unfounded. And he looked great in the car, and he looked fabulous this afternoon. He was always there, right there, particularly when the conditions were wet, semi-wet, quite difficult. There was Lando getting in the lap time, completely showing up Daniel Ricciardo, got to say. I mean, Daniel just looks like a guy who's switched off and thinking of what he's going to do in the rest of his life now. To me, it's disappointing for McLaren because Alpine had a good day. The Constructors' Championship P4 is there to be fought, and Alpine have got both cars in the top 10 in qualifying, and there's Daniel Ricciardo at the back doing nothing, and it's kind of a shame for McLaren, but nonetheless, there's Lando P4, really good. Carlos Sainz 12.3, he's got that 5-place grid penalty, so probably Ferrari, I don't know, and they're probably running a little bit less downforce than they would want on the Carlos Sainz car. Let's look at his sectors on that lap. He was in good shape in terms of being out very, very early. Ferrari did a good job with him nonetheless to get him out of the pit lane very quickly, just behind Kevin Magnussen, but he was really slow in sector 1. Probably, as I say, he's probably running a little less wing than he would really want to do in these conditions. Assuming, of course, it is going to be a dry race on Sunday, which is a big assumption because there's a lot of rain forecast as well. 18.8 sector 1. Anyway, he was very slow in sector 1. He was actually only a tenth quicker than Charles Leclerc, who was on intermediates. 36.3 sector 2. That's pretty good. That's quicker than Alonso. It's 0.2 slower than George Russell. It's quicker than Lewis Hamilton. So he's kind of there in sector 2. And 17.1 really slow in sector 3, 3.18. So that would suggest 3.18 top speed, exactly the same top speed indeed as the Haas-Ferrari, which is staggering, really, isn't it, when you think about it? That's the factory engine, and they are no quicker than the Haas-Ferrari. It just shows the job that Haas have done and how, if you like, how close they are to the Ferrari team anyway, in a number of ways with that car. But, they're allowed to do it. They haven't done anything wrong with that, and good luck to them. That's another story, of course. Charles Leclerc just does a 3.16 in a straight line, so he was slower than Carlos Sainz, but no real comparison, bearing in mind he was on the intermediates. Sergio Perez was held up by Charles Leclerc on those intermediates. He must have been thinking, he's on intermediates, Charles Leclerc's on intermediates, I'm on slicks, is this the right tyre? The track's still dry, what's going on? It took him about 2/3 of the lap to realise that he should have passed him at the first corner. And then behind Carlos Sainz came the two Alpines. Esteban Ocon slightly quicker than Fernando Alonso. Fernando, a bit like Lando Norris, whenever the conditions were really tough, he was out there going very, very quickly. He was P1 at one point in Q1. 12.4, 12.5 between the two, 10th slower than Esteban Ocon. Where was the difference there? 18.6 Sector 1, Fernando 18.9 Sector 1. So Fernando had a drama in Sector 1. I didn't see it. Could well have been into the first corner. If not, it would have been into the George Russell left-hander at the end of the straight. A rather strange thing to do on your one and only lap. Bear in mind, George was on his second lap when he did that, and already it was a bit wet, and he was trying to get a lot out of the tyres. So Fernando, obviously very slow in that Sector 1, lost 0.3 to Esteban Ocon. Otherwise, he was 0.2 quicker in Sector 2, and the same in Sector 3. And in terms of top speed, 2.97, a lot slower actually than Esteban Ocon, 3.23. It's a good recovery lap, you've got to say, from Fernando, actually to end up only a tenth slower than Esteban Ocon, bearing in mind he was 0.3 slower in Sector 1, just in Sector 1. So pretty impressive. And then there was Lewis Hamilton, who didn't get in a great lap either. In Q1, Q2, and this morning, he'd been within a tenth or two of George, but usually it was George who was slightly quicker, which would have been annoying for him. At one point, Lewis just said, I can't feel anything on the rear of the car, it's just floating. This was very early on in FP1, wasn't happy with the back end of the car at all. They were both out late, so you can't say that George had a drier track when he did the time. So let's have a look at what they did in Sector 1. Both did 18.7 in Sector 1, but Lewis really slow in Sector 2, 36.7, slightly quicker in Sector 3. So that would suggest some sort of lock-up or drama in Sector 2. And Lewis 3.22 in a straight line, slightly quicker than George. And then Charles Leclerc, P10 in the Ferrari. I mean, just so sad to see that. Actually quickest in Sector 2 out in qualifying overall. So that just shows the potential of the Ferrari. But we should always remember, of course, this is indeed a sprint weekend, and the sprint is on Saturday afternoon. Kevin Magnussen on the pole for Haas, gotta say it again. So, which meant that FP1, which was held in the dry, featured a lot of condensed long running very quickly. And all three of the top teams had a very different approach to how they're going to do it. Red Bull, for example, never ran the medium tyre at any stage. It was either the hard or the soft. They did the long runs on the soft. The Ferraris did their long runs on the medium tyre and had a mixture of the hard and the soft. And as did Mercedes, but Mercedes never ran the hard tyre at any stage. So a lot of differences between the three teams. And Mercedes got right into it with long runs straight away on the medium tyre. And have a look at them there. You can see Lewis, Hamilton and George putting in a lot of laps. And Lewis, that was when Lewis was saying the back end just feels very light, no grip at all. No real surprise there. There'd been expectation that in Brazil, really don't know why, I guess because it's relatively high altitude, nothing like as high as Mexico, of course, but it's up there with Austria, literally up there with Austria, that maybe the Mercedes, because it won't have such a top speed disadvantage, in other words, the drag factor won't be as important, that they might be really competitive again in Brazil. And if you look at those times compared there with Red Bulls, with Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez, you would say, wow, they're pretty quick, aren't they? They're very competitive. But of course, if Max Verstappen is doing 16.4, 16.6, 16.5 on the soft tyre with fuel in the car, and Lewis is doing 15.2s, 15.4s on the medium, you've got to assume Mercedes weren't running full fuel at that point. I think a better comparison is probably Ferrari, and you can see there that Charles Leclerc 13.9, 14.1, George 14.7, 14.9. That's probably more realistic. Both Lewis and George did a really quick lap at the end of the medium tyre run. I didn't include it with either because it was kind of way out of context and they'd used obviously the fuel they had in the car at that point. But if anything, that showed how good the medium tyre is in terms of longevity around Interlagos. So that was a good bit of information, I guess, for Pirelli. Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz, as I say, very similar, I think, in fuel load to Mercedes, whereas Red Bull, who did those runs in the second part of FP1, when everybody else was basically by then focusing on running the soft tyre with light fuel, there were Max and Sergio doing this homework with the Red Bulls, and I think that is a full load of fuel. Look how relatively slow they are in a straight line. There's another indication that they're carrying a very heavy load there. So no direct comparison, but interesting to see the number of laps they did and the tyres on which they did it. I also listed this morning, because it's more realistic from what we saw in qualifying, because they were proper runs in the dry and they all got in reasonably good laps, the top speeds with no fuel in the car with the soft tyre. There you can see the advantage that I was talking about. The Red Bull still carrying on, absolutely no difference from anything we've seen this year. Both of them 3-2-4, and look where Ferrari are. That's the big story. I mean, Mercedes, you could argue, yeah, they don't seem to have as much drag, but maybe they need to be running a bit more downforce. But look where Ferrari are. 3-1-6, 3-1-5 is really slow, and that's a big worry for Ferrari in terms of top speed this morning. And then finally, I think I just wanted to put this graphic up, because this was after 15 minutes of running in FP1, and it really just shows the job that Lewis Hamilton has faced this year in the Mercedes. So it's still a relatively dirty track. They haven't really got on top of the setup of the cars, Max or Lewis. And Max is on the hard tyre, Lewis is on the medium, so the hard tyre obviously is going to be slower than the medium. But at the end of the day, Lewis's medium tyre by this point has done a good 12-lap run. It's that run that he did. And they're pretty similar in terms of lap time. Max 13.5, complaining that he can't get the front tucked in how he would want to on the Red Bull. I'm sure the front end that he had was better than anything else that anybody else on the grid was having at that point, was driving with at that point, but nonetheless, he wasn't happy with it, 13.5. Lewis 13.9, so 0.4 of a second between them. But look at the splits of the lap. Max 18.5, X sector 1, Lewis 18.6, so 1/10 there. 37.8, 37.9, another 10th. 17.1, 17.3, 2/10, and then 3.25 top speed compared with Lewis's 3.18. Nothing new there, but it's just evidence with them both out on the track at the same time, same conditions, different tyres, but Lewis on the softer tyre, but nonetheless with quite a lot of mileage on it. And there's the comparison between those two. As we get to the end of this 22 season, those are the numbers that tell the story. 3.25 against 3.18. And just as a postscript to that, it's worth noting that Lewis Hamilton only just got into Q3 in Brazil. He was 9th, 11.5, Esteban Ocon 11.5, and Alex Albon 11.6, P11 going into Q3. So by a 10th, Lewis just scraped in to Q3 for the Brazilian Grand Prix. So that's where Mercedes are. Anyway, where Red Bull are is with Max Verstappen alongside the surprise pole winner for the sprint race, sorry for laughing, Kevin Magnussen in the Haas-Ferrari. So good luck to him. I suppose I've been a bit ambivalent about sprint races for quite a long time, but on this occasion, when you got that red and white Haas on the pole, you think, well, yeah, got to watch this one. This is going to be good. So I'll see you then. I'll be doing a video after that, immediately after that sprint race tomorrow. In the meantime, have a good weekend. See you soon.